The morning of November 12th, 1942, Richmond, California. Captain Giacomo Marini stood at the edge of Kaiser Shipyard No. 2, hands clasped behind his back, watching something that his training told him was impossible. Before him, workers swarmed over what had been an empty slipway just 4 days earlier. Now, a complete 10,000-ton cargo vessel hull intact, superstructure rising, smokestacks fitted, was being prepared for launch. 4 days, not 4 months. Not 4 years, as tradition and every shipbuilding manual he'd studied at the Italian Naval Academy had insisted was necessary. 4 days and 15 hours, to be precise. The ship had a name already painted on her bow, SS Robert E. Peary. She would slide into San Francisco Bay in less than an hour, and Captain Marini, formerly of the Regia Marina, now a prisoner of war wearing an American uniform with an Italy shoulder patch, understood with sudden, crushing clarity that his country had never stood a chance. The question that burned in Marini's mind, the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life, was not how the Americans had built this ship so quickly. He could see the how, the prefabricated sections, the assembly line methods, the electric welding instead of riveting, the 24-hour shifts, the women working alongside men. No, the question that tormented him was simpler and more damning. Why had no one in Rome understood what this meant? Why had Italian intelligence, German intelligence, the entire Axis war machine failed to grasp that they were fighting not a nation but an industrial colossus that could manufacture ships faster than U-boats could sink them? The Americans called these vessels Liberty ships. President Roosevelt himself had dubbed them dreadful-looking objects and ugly ducklings. But standing here, watching Robert E. Peary take shape with a speed that defied everything Marini knew about naval architecture, he understood that beauty was irrelevant, speed was everything, quantity was victory. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand the shock that paralyzed Captain Marini and hundreds of other Italian officers who witnessed American shipbuilding between 1943 and 1945, you must first understand what they came from. The Italian maritime tradition stretched back centuries. Venice had once ruled the Mediterranean with galleys built by master craftsmen who learned their trade across generations. By the 20th century, Italian shipyards in Genoa, Trieste, Monfalcone, and Livorno employed thousands of skilled workers. These were not assembly lines. These were workshops where experienced men drove hot rivets through steel plates, each rivet requiring precision and strength honed over years. A riveter's apprenticeship could last a decade. Welders, when they were used at all, were specialists whose skills approached artistry. Building a ship in Italy or anywhere in Europe, for that matter, was a methodical process governed by tradition and craftsmanship. The keel would be laid with ceremony. Then, over months, the hull would take shape, plate by plate, frame by frame. Each section required measurement, cutting, heating, fitting, riveting. The process could not be rushed. Attempts to accelerate construction risked structural failure. Italian naval architects knew this. German engineers knew this. British shipwrights knew this. It was a fundamental truth, as reliable as gravity. A proper merchant vessel required 6 months minimum from keel to launch. A destroyer might take 2 years, a cruiser 3 or more. This was simply the nature of shipbuilding. Italy had entered the war in June 1940 with approximately 450,000 gross tons of merchant shipping. By Italian standards, this was respectable. The Regia Marina had been modernizing throughout the 1930s. New standardized cargo vessels were being produced at yards like Monfalcone, modern ships with efficient diesel engines capable of 15 knots. Between 1939 and 1943, Italian yards managed to construct 36 such vessels in 8 subclasses, adding approximately 250,000 gross tons to the merchant fleet. These ships bore names honoring Italian heroes: Sebastiano Venier, after the Doge who commanded at Lepanto; Fabio Filzi, commemorating an Italian patriot executed by the Austrians in the First World War. Each vessel represented months of labor, substantial investment, and national pride. Captain Marini himself had overseen the fitting out of the destroyer Geniere at the Ansaldo shipyard in Genoa. He remembered the process intimately. The keel had been laid in February 1940. The hull construction alone took 8 months. Installing the engines, another 4. Fitting, the weapons systems, the electrical systems, the crew quarters, each stage required weeks of meticulous work. The Geniere was finally commissioned in April 1942, more than 2 years after construction began. This was considered efficient. The shipyard workers had been proud. Marini had been proud. A warship was not something to be rushed. It required precision, expertise, and time. When Italy declared war on France and Britain in June 1940, Italian strategists understood that the Mediterranean would be the decisive theatre. Control the Mediterranean, and you controlled the supply routes to North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Suez. The Regia Marina had prepared for this. Italy possessed a surface fleet, including 6 battleships, 19 cruisers, and over 120 submarines. British intelligence respected Italian naval power. So did the Americans when they entered the war. Italian tactics in the Mediterranean were often effective. Frogmen, riding manned torpedoes, had crippled British battleships at Alexandria. Submarines harassed Allied convoys. Surface raiders attacked supply lines. But none of this addressed the fundamental problem. Italy could not build ships fast enough to replace losses. By late 1942, when Captain Marini's destroyer was torpedoed by a British submarine off Cape Bon, Italy's merchant fleet had shrunk dramatically. German U-boats, operating from French Atlantic ports, were achieving spectacular success against Allied shipping. In 1942 alone, U-boats and surface raiders sank over 7 million tons of Allied shipping. German propaganda celebrated these victories. The tonnage war seemed winnable. If you could sink ships faster than the enemy could build them, eventual victory was mathematical certainty. Marini, treading water in the Mediterranean after his ship went down, had believed this. As he was pulled aboard a British destroyer and later transferred to American custody, he had believed this. Even as the transport ship carried him across the Atlantic to a prisoner of war camp in Virginia, he had believed this. The ship that transported Marini was itself a Liberty ship, though he didn't know the designation at the time. He noticed it was crude. The welds were visible, almost ugly compared to the smooth riveted hulls he knew. The design seemed primitive, a simple cargo hauler with minimal superstructure, powered by an antiquated triple-expansion steam engine. Some of the Italian officers joked about it quietly. "Brutto," one muttered. "Ugly." The ship was also slow, labouring through Atlantic swells at perhaps 11 knots. In calm seas, maybe 12. Any Italian destroyer could have run circles around it. But what Marini and his fellow prisoners did not know, could not have known, was that the ship carrying them had been constructed in 42 days. Not years, not months. 42 days from keel to launch, and it was one of hundreds. After processing at a camp in Virginia in February 1943, the Italian prisoners were offered a choice. Italy had surrendered to the Allies in September 1943. The new Badoglio government in the south had declared war on Germany. Mussolini's puppet republic in the north, under German control, was considered illegitimate by the Allies. Italian prisoners of war could volunteer for Italian service units, essentially labor battalions, serving under American command. They would wear American uniforms with Italian shoulder patches. They would receive better rations, more freedom of movement, and modest pay. The alternative was remaining in standard POW camps with restricted privileges. Of the 51,000 Italian prisoners of war held in the United States, more than 45,000 volunteered for the service units. The officers like Marini faced a more difficult choice. Under the Geneva Convention, officers could not be compelled to perform manual labor. But many volunteered anyway. Some were pragmatic. Others were ideologically opposed to fascism and genuinely wanted to support the Allied cause. Many simply wanted to be useful, to feel less like captives. Marini volunteered for complex reasons he could not fully articulate even to himself. His family was in Naples, which had been liberated by the Allies. The war in Italy was not his war anymore. The cause he had served seemed, in retrospect, hollow. So in April 1943, he signed the papers, swore an oath to the Badoglio government, and was assigned to a service unit being sent to California. The train journey west took 5 days. Marini and the other Italian officers watched America pass outside the windows. The scale was overwhelming. Cities that seemed larger than Rome, farmland that stretched to the horizon, freight trains a mile long hauling materials, factories belching smoke day and night. None of it had been touched by war. No bombed-out buildings, no rubble-filled streets, no signs of deprivation. American civilians seemed well-fed, well-dressed. The contrast to Italy, where rationing had reduced the population to near starvation, where entire cities had been reduced to rubble, was staggering. One officer remarked, "They are fighting a war on 2 fronts, and their people live better than ours did in peacetime." No one disagreed. Richmond, California, in April 1943, was barely recognizable compared to what it had been 3 years earlier. Before the war, Richmond had been a modest town of 23,000 people, known for little except oil refineries. Then Henry Kaiser arrived. Kaiser was an industrialist who had made his fortune building dams, the Hoover Dam most famously. He knew large-scale construction. He knew logistics. He understood mass production. But he had never built a ship. When the Maritime Commission began soliciting bids for emergency cargo vessels in 1940, Kaiser submitted a proposal for a massive shipbuilding operation in Richmond. Experienced shipbuilders laughed. You couldn't just decide to build ships. It required expertise, tradition, and skilled craftsmen developed over generations. Kaiser ignored them and built 4 shipyards on 90 acres of San Francisco Bay waterfront. By 1943, when Marini arrived, Richmond's population had exploded to over 100,000. The shipyards operated around the clock, 7 days a week, never stopping. The Italian service unit to which Marini belonged was assigned to loading operations at Kaiser Richmond Yard No. 2. Their job was straightforward: carry supplies, equipment, and cargo aboard, completed Liberty ships docked at the fitting-out berths. It was manual labor, beneath the dignity of naval officers in the Old World. But this was not the Old World, and the work gave them unrestricted access to the shipyard. They could see everything. Within the first week, Marini understood he was witnessing something unprecedented in human history. The scale defied comprehension. 4 massive shipways, each capable of building a complete vessel simultaneously, overhead gantry cranes that could lift 150 tons, fabrication shops the size of aircraft hangars where hull sections were pre-assembled, rail lines running directly into the yard, delivering prefabricated components from factories across California and beyond. But it was the speed that shattered every assumption Marini had brought with him from Italy. On his first day, he watched workers on Shipway 3 lower a complete bow section already fully assembled, including deck plating, bulkheads, and crew quarters into position using a massive crane. In an Italian yard, that bow section would have been built in place over 6 weeks. Here, it arrived completely on a rail car and was fitted in 4 hours. Immediately, dozens of welders swarmed over the joints, their torches blazing in synchronized rows. The sound was deafening. Sparks showered down like rain. Within a day, the bow was permanently attached. On Shipway 1, he saw the keel laid for a new vessel. By the standards he knew, this was the beginning of a 6-month process. He made a note of the date, April 14th, 1943. He decided to track this ship's construction to see how long the Americans actually took. The answer was 37 days. On May 21st, that ship, the SS James W., Marshall slid down the ways into the bay, 37 days from keel to launch. Marini checked his notes multiple times, certain he had made an error. But there was no error. He asked one of the American foremen, a man named Sullivan who spoke some Italian, how this was possible. Sullivan shrugged. "Prefab sections," he said. "We build the pieces in the shops, bring 'em in by rail, weld 'em together, like an erector set." Marini didn't know what an erector set was. Sullivan tried to explain a children's toy, metal, pieces that snapped together to make structures. Marini understood the concept, but a ship was not a toy. Ships required precision engineering, careful measurement, and skilled craftsmanship. "Sure," Sullivan said, "but if you make all the pieces to exact specifications in controlled conditions, assembly is just assembly, faster than building in place." The logic was sound. Marini could see that, but emotionally, psychologically, it violated something fundamental. Ships were not assembled, they were built. There was a difference, though Marini struggled to articulate what that difference was. He watched the welders. Many were women. This alone was shocking. In Italy, welding was a skilled trade requiring years of training. Here, women who had been secretaries or housewives 6 months ago were doing the work. Marini asked Sullivan about this. "Training program," Sullivan explained. 8 weeks. Teaches you electric arc welding, how to read blueprints, safety protocols. After that, you're on the line. 8 weeks. In Italy, a welding apprenticeship took 3 years minimum. "But the quality," Marini began. Sullivan cut him off. "Quality's fine. We X-ray the welds, test the plates. These ships hold together. Yeah, they're not pretty, but they work. Work." That was the American philosophy reduced to a single word. It didn't matter if the ships were beautiful. It didn't matter if they honored centuries of maritime tradition. They had to work. They had to carry 10,000 tons of cargo across an ocean. If they survived one voyage, they had paid for themselves. Marini learned that Liberty ships cost approximately $2 million to construct. A single cargo load to Britain or the Mediterranean was worth more than that. As long as more than half the ships survived their first voyage, America came out ahead, and the survival rate was much higher than half. German U-boats were lethal, yes, but they could not be everywhere. The Atlantic was vast, convoys were large, and most importantly, ships were arriving faster than submarines could sink them. Marini obtained statistics from American newspapers, which were freely available even to prisoners. The numbers were published openly, as if the American government wanted the enemy to know, and wanted to demoralize them with the sheer scale of production. In 1942, Allied shipping losses totaled nearly 8 million tons. Devastating, unsustainable, it seemed. But American and British shipyards had produced over 7 million tons of new shipping that same year. In 1943, the balance shifted decisively. Losses dropped to 3.2 million tons due to improved convoy tactics and escort carriers. Meanwhile, American yards alone produced over 19 million tons of new shipping. 19 million tons in a single year. For context, Italy's entire merchant marine at the start of the war had been 3.4 million tons. The mathematics were brutally simple. America was building ships nearly 6 times faster than Germany could sink them. The Italian officers discussed this endlessly in their barracks at night. Some refused to believe the numbers. Propaganda, one insisted, inflated for morale purposes. No one can build ships that fast. But Marini had watched the James W. Marshall go from keel to launch in 37 days. He had seen it with his own eyes. The numbers were real. Another officer, a former instructor at the Italian Naval Academy, tried to maintain some professional dignity. Yes, they build many ships, but what about quality? Surely these hastily constructed vessels are unseaworthy. They will break apart in storms. They will require constant repairs. Marini wanted to believe this, but he had crossed the Atlantic on one of these ugly ducklings. It had performed adequately. And he had learned that Liberty ships were already proving themselves in combat operations, supplying British forces in North Africa, Russia, via the Murmansk Run, island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific. There were failures. Marini learned about these too. Some Liberty ships had suffered catastrophic structural failures, the hulls literally breaking in half without warning. 12 ships had been lost this way. The problem was brittle fracture in cold water, caused by the steel's transition from ductile to brittle at low temperatures. The welds concentrated stress rather than distributing it the way rivets did. American metallurgists were working on the problem, modifying steel composition and welding procedures. But here was the essential point. 12 ships out of 2,700 had failed catastrophically. That was a failure rate of less than 0.5%. In any other context, such a rate would be considered remarkable quality control. And even accounting for those losses, production so vastly exceeded demand that the failures were statistical noise. By summer 1943, Marini had been at Richmond for 4 months. He had watched 7 Liberty ships progress from keel to launch. The average construction time was 39 days. He had helped load 32 completed ships with cargo, everything from tanks and trucks to medical supplies and rations. He had seen the shipyard expand, adding more fabrication shops, more berths, more workers. Kaiser now employed 90,000 people across his 4 Richmond yards. 90,000. That was more than the entire population of Richmond before the war. The workforce was diverse in ways that would have been unthinkable in Italy. White, black, Hispanic, Asian, men and women, young and old, skilled craftsmen working alongside former shop clerks who had learned their trade in 8 weeks, and Richmond was just one operation. Marini learned there were 18 shipyards building Liberty ships across the United States, Bethlehem Fairfield in Baltimore, New England Shipbuilding in Maine, Delta Shipbuilding in New Orleans, Todd Houston, Southeastern in Savannah, Oregon Shipbuilding. Each yard operated multiple shipways. Each yard ran 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. The production numbers were staggering. In 1943 alone, American yards launched over 1,900 Liberty ships. That was more than 5 ships per day, every day, for the entire year. And Liberty ships were just the cargo vessels. The same yards were also producing destroyers, destroyer escorts, Casablanca-class escort carriers, landing ships for amphibious operations. One morning in August 1943, Marini was supervising a loading detail when he encountered a man named Antonio Costa. Costa was also Italian, but not a prisoner. He was a civilian, an immigrant who had lived in California for 20 years. He worked as a translator and labor coordinator for the service units. Costa and Marini spoke in Italian, and Marini asked the question that had been haunting him. How did we not know? How did Italian intelligence fail to understand what America was capable of? Costa lit a cigarette and considered this. Because you never came here, he said finally. You saw the America that wanted to be seen New York, maybe Washington, bankers and diplomats. You didn't see this. He gestured at the shipyard, the cranes, the ships under construction. This is the real America, not the cities, the factories, and you can't understand it unless you see it. Costa explained something Marini had not considered. Before the war, America had produced automobiles on an unprecedented scale. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, these companies had perfected assembly line mass production. In 1941, American automobile production totaled nearly 4 million vehicles. 4 million. Then, almost overnight, those factories converted to war production. The same assembly lines that had produced sedans and trucks now produced tanks, aircraft, artillery pieces. The same workers, the same techniques, the same industrial philosophy, standardization, prefabrication, mass production. You cannot fight a factory, Costa said quietly. That's what you were trying to do, fight a factory, and you cannot win. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Marini thought about this constantly over the following months. His duties expanded. By autumn 1943, he was coordinating loading operations for multiple service units, which gave him access to production schedules and shipping manifests. He saw the cargo that went into these Liberty ships: tanks by the dozen, artillery pieces, trucks, jeeps, railroad locomotives, millions of rounds of ammunition, thousands of tons of fuel, food supplies sufficient to feed an army for months. And this was just what he could see at one shipyard. Multiply this by 18 yards, by hundreds of ships per month, and the scale became incomprehensible. Italy's entire industrial capacity could not have produced what he saw loaded onto a single Liberty ship in a week. He remembered a lecture from the Naval Academy given by an admiral who had studied in Britain. The admiral had explained the concept of fleet in being, the strategic value of a navy, not through constant action, but through its mere existence, forcing the enemy to divert resources to counter it. Britain's Royal Navy had dominated through this principle for centuries, but America had inverted the concept. American industrial capacity was a factory in being, its strategic value not through what it produced at any given moment, but through its sheer potential to produce. Germany had made a catastrophic miscalculation. German strategists had assumed American industry would require years to convert to war production, just as German industry had required years. But American industry had no such lag. The factories already existed. The workforce already, existed. The techniques already existed. All that was required was conversion, and conversion took months, not years. By late 1943, Marini had stopped thinking of himself as a prisoner and started thinking of himself as a witness. He felt an obligation to document what he was seeing, though he wasn't sure for whom or why. He kept detailed notes in a diary, recording production numbers, construction times, observations about methods and techniques. He sketched the shipyard layout, the assembly process, and the workflow. Some of this was technically against regulations. Prisoners were not supposed to possess detailed information about military production facilities. But the guards were lax. The information was not particularly secret. Most of it appeared in American newspapers anyway. The government seemed to want the world to know, seemed to want enemies and allies alike to understand the scale of American industrial power. In November 1943, Marini witnessed the construction of a Liberty ship from start to finish on a compressed timeline. Richmond Yard No. 2 was preparing for a ceremony. The shipyard had been selected to break the speed record set by Oregon Shipbuilding, which had built a Liberty ship in 10 days the previous year. Henry Kaiser himself would attend. Newsreel cameras would film it. The propaganda value was obvious, but that didn't make the achievement less real. Marini watched preparations with professional interest. Additional workers were brought in. Materials were staged. Prefabricated sections were prepared and tested before the keel was laid. On November 8, 1943, at exactly 1 minute after midnight, workers laid the keel for what would become the SS Robert E. Peary. Marini was there, standing at the edge of the shipway with other Italian officers. The keel plates were massive, each weighing several tons, but they dropped into position with precision. Immediately, welders descended, securing the plates. By dawn, the keel was complete, and the framework for the first hull sections was being erected. Day 1 was a blur of activity. Prefabricated sections arrived by rail every few hours. Cranes lifted them into position. Welders worked in synchronized teams. The noise was constant, overwhelming. Marini tried to count the workers on the shipway but lost track after 200. By day 2, the hull was taking recognizable shape. Complete sections already, including deck plating, bulkheads, internal framing, were being fitted together like pieces of a giant three-dimensional puzzle. The welding was crude, fast, and functional. No one cared about aesthetics. This was about speed and structural integrity, nothing more. By day 3, the hull was nearly complete. Engine mounts were installed. The superstructure began rising. Crew quarters, galley, bridge, all prefabricated, all lifted into place as complete units. Day 4 saw the final hull plates fitted, the smokestacks installed, the deck guns mounted. On the afternoon of day 4, workers began preparing the slipway for launch. On November 12th, at 3:30 in the afternoon, 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after the keel was laid, the SS Robert E. Peary slid down the ways into San Francisco Bay. Marini watched from the crowd. Newsreel cameras rolled. Henry Kaiser stood on a platform beaming. The ship hit the water with a massive splash. Tugboats moved in immediately to tow her to a fitting-out berth, where final work would be completed over the next several days, installing electrical systems, testing engines, loading supplies. But the hull was complete. The ship was real. 4 days. Marini felt something break inside him at that moment. Not despair, exactly. More like recognition. This was why Italy had lost. This was why Germany would lose. Not because of superior tactics or better soldiers or more advanced technology. America would win because America could do this. could build a 10,000-ton cargo ship in 4 days, could do it again and again, 18 shipyards operating simultaneously, never stopping. You could sink every ship America built in a year, and America would simply build more the next year. The mathematics were inexorable. That evening, back in the barracks, the Italian officers sat in near silence. Someone finally spoke. We were told America was weak, soft, industrially inferior to Germany. Another officer laughed bitterly. We were told many things. Marini said nothing. He was thinking about the Robert E. Peary, about the 4 days, about the 2,710 Liberty ships that would eventually be built. He was thinking about Italy, about shipyards in Genoa that took 2 years to build a destroyer, about an entire nation's industrial output being less than what one American shipyard produced in a month. He was thinking about all the Italian sailors who had died believing they were fighting for a cause that could win when the outcome had been decided before the first shot was fired. Over the winter of 1943 into 1944, more Italian prisoners arrived at Richmond as the campaign in Italy continued. Marini spoke with them, gathering information about the situation back home. The news was uniformly grim. Allied bombers were pounding northern Italian cities. German forces occupying the north were treating Italians as conquered enemies rather than former allies. In the south, under Allied control, food was scarce despite American aid. The industrial infrastructure had been devastated. Shipyards in Genoa, Trieste, and Livorno were rubble. Even if Italy wanted to rebuild its merchant fleet after the war, it would take decades to restore the capacity. Meanwhile, at Richmond, production accelerated. By early 1944, Kaiser's 4 yards were launching a Liberty ship every single day. 1 ship every day, just from Richmond. Multiply this by 17 other shipyards, and the numbers became surreal. In January 1944 alone, American yards launched 147 Liberty ships. That was more than Italy had built in the first 40 years of the 20th century. By spring 1944, the crisis in Allied shipping had essentially been solved. There were more ships available than cargo to fill them. The U-boat threat, while still dangerous, had been mathematically defeated. German submarines could not possibly sink ships faster than American yards built them. Marini began to understand something else. The Liberty ship program was not just about winning the war. It was about demonstrating capability. It was a message to allies and enemies alike. America wanted everyone to know what it could do, wanted to establish beyond doubt that American industrial power was unmatched and unmatchable. This was psychological warfare of a different sort, not propaganda about military prowess, but simple, verifiable facts about production capacity. The numbers were published openly. The ships were visible. You could watch them being built. You could sail on them. You could not deny their existence. In June 1944, Allied forces landed at Normandy. Marini watched newsreels of the invasion at the shipyard cafeteria, where they were shown to boost morale. The scale of the operation was staggering. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men, mountains of equipment, and all of it had to be transported across the Atlantic, loaded onto those ships in American ports, carried to Britain, then ferried across the Channel. Liberty ships were the backbone of this operation. Without them, without the massive cargo capacity they represented, the invasion would have been impossible. A German prisoner there were a few at Richmond, kept separate from the Italians, told Marini something revealing. The man had been a U-boat crewman, captured when his submarine was sunk by an American destroyer escort. "We knew we couldn't win," the German said in broken English. "By 1943, we knew. The tonnage war was lost. For every ship we sank, you built 5 more, but we kept fighting because what else could we do? Marini understood this. The war continued not because victory was possible, but because surrender seemed impossible. Nations, like men, could not simply give up. They fought until they had no strength left to fight. By autumn 1944, Marini had been at Richmond for more than a year. He had watched dozens of Liberty ships go from keel to launch. He had loaded hundreds more with cargo. He knew the ships intimately, now their capabilities, their limitations, their quirks. They were crude vessels, ugly and utilitarian. They leaked. Their engines were underpowered. In heavy seas, they laboured. But they worked. They did their job. And in war, that was all that mattered. Elegance was a peacetime luxury. Victory went to whoever could produce the most functional equipment the fastest. The Italian service unit program expanded throughout 1944. Eventually, more than 40,000 Italian prisoners were working across the United States in agriculture, in factories, in ports, on construction projects. They contributed millions of man-hours to the American war effort, freeing American workers for military service or other essential jobs. The irony was not lost on Marini. Italy was now helping build the very industrial capacity that had defeated it. But the irony had ceased to be bitter. Marini no longer felt anger or resentment. He felt something closer to resignation mixed with a strange kind of admiration. America had done what Italy could not. There was no shame in acknowledging this, only in refusing to see it. In December 1944, Marini received word that his family in Naples was safe. Allied occupation had been difficult, but they had survived. His father, who had been a merchant captain before the war, was working with Allied authorities to restore port operations. Italy was beginning the long process of recovery. Marini wrote to his father, trying to explain what he had witnessed in California. "Papa," he wrote, "you cannot imagine the scale of what I have seen here. America does not build ships the way we built ships. They manufacture them, the way a factory manufactures automobiles. I have watched them build a complete cargo vessel in less than 5 days. 5 days, Papa. I know this sounds impossible. I would not have believed it if I had not seen it with my own eyes. We never had a chance against this. No nation does." His father's reply came 2 months later. "Giacomo, I believe what you tell me, and it makes me think perhaps this is not a bad thing. If America can build so much so quickly, perhaps they can also help rebuild. Perhaps their ships, their factories, their industrial power can be turned to peace as quickly as they were turned to war. There is always hope, my son." Marini held on to this thought. By spring of 1945, the war in Europe was clearly ending. Germany was collapsing. Allied forces were driving into the heart of the Reich. In the Pacific, American forces were island-hopping toward Japan. Liberty ships were supplying all of it Europe, the Pacific, every theatre of operation. The ships Marini had watched being built were now all over the world, carrying the cargo that would end the war. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. In August, after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Marini and the other Italian prisoners began repatriation processing almost immediately. By September 1945, he was on a ship bound for Naples, a Liberty ship, naturally. During the crossing, he stood on deck and looked at the vessel, really looked at it. The crude welds, the utilitarian design, the simple, functional layout. This ugly duckling had won the war, not because it was a better ship than anything Italy or Germany had built. It wasn't. But because America could build thousands of them faster than the enemy could destroy them, quantity had overwhelmed quality. Production had defeated craftsmanship. When Marini returned to Naples, he found a city devastated by war but slowly recovering. The port was operating again, though at reduced capacity. His father was there, older and thinner but alive. They embraced. That evening, sitting in what remained of their family home, Marini told his father everything he had seen: the shipyards, the assembly lines, the 4-day construction time, the 2,710 ships. His father listened without interrupting. When Marini finished, his father was quiet for a long moment. "You know," his father finally said, "before the war, I would have called such things impossible. I would have said ships cannot be built that way, that it violates everything we know about maritime construction. But I think we were wrong. We were still building ships the way the Venetians built galleys one at a time, with care and artistry. The Americans understood something we didn't. In modern war, a fleet of imperfect ships beats a handful of perfect ones. The question now is whether Italy can learn this lesson." Marini didn't know. In the immediate post-war years, Italy focused on survival, finding food, rebuilding infrastructure, treating the wounded, burying the dead. But by the late 1940s, something remarkable began happening. Greek and Italian shipping magnates started purchasing surplus Liberty ships from the American government. 526 ships went to Greek buyers. 98 went to Italians. These ugly ducklings, built in American shipyards with American methods, became the foundation for the post-war revival of Mediterranean shipping. Aristotle Onassis built his empire with surplus Liberty ships. So did Stavros Niarchos, and Andrea Corrado, the dominant Italian shipping magnate, rebuilt his entire fleet with American-built vessels. Marini himself returned to sea in 1948 as first officer on a Liberty ship owned by a Genoese shipping company. The ship had been built at Richmond in 1944. Marini knew because the builder's plate was still affixed to the bridge. Kaiser Company, Incorporated, Richmond, California, Yard No. 2. He had probably watched this very ship being built. The irony was almost unbearable, but also somehow fitting. Italy had not been able to build enough ships to compete, so Italy bought American ships and used them to rebuild its merchant marine. The Liberty ship Marini served on was renamed Città di Napoli, City of Naples. It was still crude, still ugly, still underpowered, but it worked. It carried cargo reliably and profitably. Over the next decade, Marini served on 3 more Liberty ships, eventually becoming captain of one. He grew to appreciate their virtues. They were simple to maintain. Parts were interchangeable. Repairs were straightforward. The design prioritized function over form, efficiency over aesthetics. They were not ships you fell in love with, but they were ships you could depend on. By the 1950s, Marini was captain of a modern Italian-built cargo vessel, finally working on a ship that reflected Italian shipbuilding tradition, sleek, well-crafted, efficient, but he never forgot the Liberty ships. They had taught him something fundamental about the modern world. Victory in industrial warfare did not go to those with the most skill or the best traditions, but to those who could produce the most, the fastest. America had understood this. Italy had not. The cost of that ignorance had been defeated. In his later years, Marini occasionally gave talks at the Italian Naval Academy, where he had once been a student. He would describe what he had witnessed at Richmond. Some of the younger officers were skeptical. "Surely you exaggerate," one said. 4 days to build a ship? Impossible. Marini would show them the documentation, the production records, the photographs, the newsreel footage. The evidence was overwhelming. "I exaggerate nothing," he would say. "This is what happened. This is what America did. And if you do not understand this, you do not understand modern warfare." The lesson of the Liberty ships was not just about shipbuilding, it was about industrial philosophy. It was about the conflict between craftsmanship and mass production, between quality and quantity, between tradition and innovation. Europe had clung to the old ways: skilled labor, careful construction, time-intensive methods. America had embraced the new assembly lines, prefabrication, standardization. In peacetime, the European approach produced superior individual products, but in war, the American approach produced more products faster, and in war, more was better. 1,000 adequate ships beat 100 perfect ships. 10,000 adequate tanks beat 1,000 perfect tanks. This was the mathematics of total war, and Italy had never learned the equation. Marini died in 1978, having lived long enough to see Italy recover and prosper in the post-war era. He never returned to the United States, though he sometimes thought about it. He wondered if the Richmond shipyards were still there, if they still built ships. He learned they had been largely demolished after the war, the land converted to other uses. The emergency was over. The massive production capacity was no longer needed. America had built what it needed to win and then stopped, as simply as turning off a machine. But the Liberty ships remained those that had survived. Hundreds were sold for scrap. Others were converted to peacetime use. A handful were preserved as museum ships. Marini read that, too, the SS John W. Brown and the SS Jeremiah O'Brien were maintained in operational condition. He found this appropriate. Future generations should see them and should understand what they represent, not just as historical artifacts, but as lessons in industrial capability, in mass production, in the power of quantity over quality when circumstances demanded it. The central irony that had struck Marini that morning in November 1942 remained true for the rest of his life. Italy had entered the war thinking it understood its enemy, thinking it knew the limits of American industrial power. Italian strategists had made calculations based on pre-war American production rates, on traditional shipbuilding timelines, on conventional understanding of industrial capacity. All of those calculations had been wrong. They had failed to account for America's unique advantage, not better technology or more skilled workers, but a fundamentally different industrial philosophy. America treated manufacturing like a problem to be solved through engineering and organization. If you needed more ships, you didn't just build more shipyards. You redesigned the entire process to maximize efficiency. The Liberty ship program embodied this philosophy. The ships themselves were deliberately simple. They used obsolete steam engines that were easier to produce than modern diesel engines. They used electric welding instead of riveting because welding was faster to learn. They were designed for a 5-year service life, not decades. They sacrificed speed for cargo capacity. They sacrificed elegance for functionality. Every design decision prioritized one thing: maximum production in minimum time. And it worked. By the end of the war, Liberty ships had carried 69% of all American cargo to overseas ports. They had sustained the invasion of Europe. They had supplied the island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. They had kept Britain fed and armed during its darkest hours. And yet, for all their importance, Liberty ships were not celebrated. They received no glory. Newsreels showed battleships and aircraft carriers, fighters and bombers. The humble cargo vessels that made everything else possible remained in the background, unnoticed except by those who depended on them. This, too, was appropriate. Liberty ships were workers, not heroes. They were tools, not symbols. They did their job without fanfare or recognition, and that was exactly what they were designed to do. Marini understood this by the end of his life. He had begun the war as a proud officer of the Regia Marina, confident in Italian naval tradition, secure in his training and expertise. He had ended the war as a witness to America's industrial revolution in warfare, understanding that expertise and tradition meant nothing against overwhelming material superiority. This was not a comfortable lesson. It stripped away pride and replaced it with pragmatic realism. But it was a necessary lesson. Italy had learned it the hard way. Other nations would learn it too, eventually. Modern warfare was not about honor or skill or courage, though those things mattered. It was about production capacity, logistical efficiency, and industrial organization. The nation that could produce the most weapons, feed the most soldiers, and move the most supplies would win. Everything else was secondary. The Liberty ships proved this beyond any doubt. They were not elegant or advanced or admirable by traditional standards, but they were numerous and functional and utterly decisive. They represented a new kind of power, industrial power applied without restraint or tradition, organized purely for maximum output. Captain Giacomo Marini, standing at the edge of Kaiser Shipyard No. 2 on that November morning in 1942, watching the Robert E. Peary take shape impossibly fast, had been among the first to truly comprehend what this meant. He had seen the future of warfare, and it looked like an assembly line. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.